James Stevenson gazed at the towering marble staircase of his mansion with a mix of determination and mild regret. Was this plan insane? Absolutely. But if anyone could pull it off, it was him. After all, being a billionaire came with perks, like buying absolute loyalty or faking a life-altering injury without breaking a sweat. "Mr. Stevenson, are you sure about this?" asked Andrew, his butler, whose skeptical tone bordered on disapproval. "Positive," James replied, adjusting the padding beneath his shirt to simulate the fall. "People have been circling me like vultures for years. This is the only way to see who's genuinely on my side." Andrew frowned. "You could just, I don't know, ask them?" "Where's the fun in that?" James grinned, his trademark charm sparkling even in moments of absurdity. He patted Andrew on the shoulder. "Don't worry, I've got it all planned. It'll be like a soap opera, but with better acting." Moments later, James dramatically tumbled down the staircase, landing in a carefully staged heap at the bottom. Andrew rushed to his side, his acting almost as convincing as the sound effects James had hired a professional to install. "Sir, are you all right?" Andrew exclaimed, clutching James's shoulder with just the right amount of panic. James groaned for effect. "I can't feel my legs," he murmured, his voice shaky but resolute. The news broke within hours. Tragic accident leaves billionaire James Stevenson paralyzed. Social media exploded with hashtags like #PrayForStevenson and Billionaire Strong. Calls flooded his office, and his sprawling mansion quickly became the epicenter of sympathy. James watched the chaos unfold from his now permanent spot in the grand living room, seated in a state-of-the-art wheelchair he had purchased weeks in advance. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was a man used to controlling empires, now pretending to have lost control of his own body. His wife, Marla, made her grand entrance 2 days after the accident. Dressed impeccably in a designer suit, she wore an expression of carefully rehearsed concern. "Jimmy," she cooed, kneeling beside his wheelchair and taking his hand. He hated when she called him that. "You poor thing. How are you holding up?" "I've been better," James replied dryly. "But I'm managing." "I just can't believe this happened to you," Marla continued, her eyes glistening with what might have been genuine tears, or a drop of saline solution. James forced a smile, already making a mental note of her body language. She was good at putting on a show, but she always overplayed her hand when cameras weren't around. Then came the visitors, friends, employees, and business associates, all eager to express their sympathy. One by one, James studied them like a hawk, noting who lingered too long near his desk, who avoided his gaze, and who suddenly became overly interested in his accounts. "James, buddy," boomed Steve, his oldest friend and the self-proclaimed king of real estate. He arrived with a bouquet so large it could have doubled as a hedge. "Man, I'm gutted. If you need anything, anything at all, you just say the word." "Thanks, Steve," James replied, watching as Steve's eyes darted toward the wall safe in the corner. Steve clapped him on the shoulder. "You know, I've got this killer investment opportunity. Real low risk, high reward. You'd love it." James raised an eyebrow. "You're pitching me a deal while I'm in a wheelchair?" Steve laughed nervously. "No, no, of course not. Just something to think about for the future." But not everyone disappointed him. Lisa, the nurse he had hired through a top-tier agency, was refreshingly straightforward. "You look miserable," she remarked bluntly during her first shift, setting down a tray of carefully prepared food. "Gee, thanks," James replied, his sarcasm met with a grin. "I mean it," she continued, plopping into the armchair across from him. "You're a billionaire stuck in a wheelchair, eating steamed broccoli. If I were you, I'd be throwing a tantrum by now." James chuckled, despite himself. "And here I thought nurses were supposed to be all sunshine and rainbows." Lisa shrugged. "I'm not most nurses. Besides, sunshine's overrated." Her candid nature was a breath of fresh air. Unlike everyone else, she wasn't trying to impress him or get something out of him. Or so he thought. As the days turned into weeks, James couldn't shake the feeling that Lisa was sharper than she let on. And when she casually remarked one day, "You know, I bet with some effort, you could regain feeling in your legs," he nearly dropped his cup of coffee. "Why would you say that?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. Lisa smirked. "Oh, no reason. Just a hunch." James leaned back in his wheelchair, his mind racing. If Lisa suspected something, she wasn't letting on. And for the first time in weeks, he felt a twinge of nervousness. His grand experiment was working. But at what cost? And more importantly, who else might be onto him? James had always considered himself a good judge of character. But as the weeks passed, he realized just how wrong he had been. The mansion, which once buzzed with activity, now felt like a theater, with each visitor playing their part on his elaborate stage. "Good morning, Mr. Stevenson," Andrew greeted as he wheeled James into the sunroom. The butler's usual formality felt slightly stiffer than before, as if he were tiptoeing around the man who could no longer walk. "Morning, Andrew. Anything interesting on the agenda today?" James asked, his tone deliberately casual. Andrew hesitated. "Your wife has requested a meeting with the accountants this afternoon. Something about streamlining expenses." James smirked. "Streamlining, huh? Let me guess. She wants to help manage my funds." Andrew gave a slight nod, his lips twitching in what might have been amusement. That afternoon, Marla swept into the sunroom, her presence as commanding as ever. She wore a sleek black dress and heels that clicked sharply against the marble floor. "Jimmy," she began, her voice dripping with practiced sweetness, "I've been thinking. With everything going on, you shouldn't have to stress about the little things. Let me handle the accounts for you." James raised an eyebrow. "Little things? Like my billion-dollar investments?" Marla laughed, a little too brightly. "Oh, don't be dramatic. It's just temporary. I want to take some of the burden off your shoulders." "How thoughtful of you," James replied, his voice cool. "But I'll manage." Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered. "Of course, darling. I only want what's best for you." As she turned to leave, James noticed her glance toward his desk, where his laptop sat locked and secure. Later that evening, James found himself in his study, his wheelchair positioned near the fireplace. Lisa entered with her usual no-nonsense energy, balancing a tray of sandwiches and 2 mugs of coffee. "You look like you're plotting world domination," she said, setting the tray down. "Something like that," James replied, grabbing a mug. "Marla wants control of my accounts." Lisa snorted. "Big surprise. She's been circling you like a hawk since day one." James leaned forward. "And what about you? What's your angle?" Lisa pretended to be offended. "Me? I'm just here for the charming conversation and world-class company." James chuckled. "Right. And the paycheck has nothing to do with it?" Lisa grinned. "Okay, fine. The paycheck helps. But seriously, you've got a lot of people playing games around you. I hope you're keeping score." "Oh, I am," James said, his eyes narrowing. The next morning, Steve arrived with his usual flair, dressed in a suit that screamed real estate mogul. He sauntered into the sunroom and slapped James on the back. "Jimmy, how's my favorite billionaire doing?" "Better, now that you're here to entertain me," James said dryly. Steve laughed, plopping into the chair opposite James. "Listen, buddy, I've got this golden opportunity for you. Prime real estate, low risk, high reward. You'd be crazy not to jump on it." James studied him, his expression unreadable. "You do realize I can't exactly jump on anything right now, Steve." Steve froze, then forced a laugh. "Good one, but seriously, this deal is once in a lifetime. You trust me, right?" James took a sip of coffee, his gaze steady. "Of course, I trust you, Steve. That's why I'm going to pass. But thanks for thinking of me." Steve's smile faltered, but he quickly covered it up. "Well, if you change your mind, you know where to find me." As Steve left, James made a mental note to dig deeper into his so-called friend's recent activities. That evening, as the sun set over the estate, James and Lisa sat on the terrace. "Your social circle's a real circus," Lisa remarked, sipping her coffee. "You don't know the half of it," James muttered. Lisa leaned back, studying him. "So, what's the end game here? Prove everyone's terrible and then what?" James hesitated. "I don't know yet. Maybe it's just about finding one person who's not in it for themselves." Lisa's expression softened. "Well, good luck with that." "Billionaires don't exactly attract selfless types," James smirked. "And yet, here you are." Lisa shrugged. "I'm an enigma. Deal with it." As she stood to leave, James watched her go, a strange feeling settling in his chest. He wasn't sure if he was closer to unraveling the truth or just tying himself in more knots. Either way, the experiment was far from over. James sat in his study, the glow of the fire flickering across his face. The weight of his secret felt heavier by the day, and the cast of characters in his life grew more theatrical by the hour. Marla's not-so-subtle scheming, Steve's shameless pitches, even his butler Andrew had started acting like he was auditioning for a role in a suspense thriller. But Lisa, Lisa was different. She was clever, too clever for someone he expected to be a simple nurse. And then there was the way she looked at him, not with pity or calculation, but with a mix of amusement and curiosity. It was unsettling, and James hated feeling unsettled. Enough, he muttered to himself. Tonight, he would tell her the truth. Lisa arrived at her usual time, balancing a tray of snacks and her ever-present mug of coffee. You really need to fire whoever stocks your kitchen, she said, setting the tray down. Do you know how many different types of quinoa I found in your pantry? Quinoa! What kind of monster eats that much bird food? James smirked. A wealthy one, apparently. Lisa rolled her eyes and flopped into the armchair across from him. So, what's on your mind? You look like you're either plotting world domination or trying to decide between Netflix and Hulu. James leaned back in his wheelchair, studying her. What would you say if I told you I've been lying this whole time? Lisa didn't miss a beat. I'd say, congratulations, you're finally admitting it. James froze. What? Lisa grinned, sipping her coffee. Oh, come on, James. You're about as paralyzed as my goldfish. He blinked, completely thrown off. How did you know? You twitched your foot once when you were sleeping, she said, casually picking up a cookie. Honestly, I'm surprised no one else caught on. You're not exactly subtle. James stared at her, speechless. And you didn't say anything? Lisa shrugged. Why ruin the fun? Watching you play Pup Master has been the highlight of my week. For the first time in months, James felt like the control he so carefully maintained was slipping. If you knew, why did you stay? Lisa leaned forward, her expression softening. Because you're not as bad as you think you are. You're just lonely. And a little ridiculous, but mostly lonely. James let out a short laugh, more from relief than amusement. You've got a strange way of showing sympathy. Lisa smirked. Hey, I'm not here to fluff your ego. That's what Marla and Steve are for. James sobered at the mention of their names. What do you think of them? Lisa raised an eyebrow. Marla's a snake in heels, and Steve's the kind of guy who'd sell you a timeshare on the moon if he thought he could get away with it. Accurate, James muttered, rubbing his temples. I thought this experiment would help me figure out who I could trust. Instead, it's just made me realize how alone I really am. Lisa's voice softened. Maybe you're looking in the wrong places. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, but James couldn't shake the feeling that Lisa's words had hit a nerve. Later that night, as he sat alone in the quiet mansion, he thought about what she'd said. He had spent his life building walls, protecting himself from betrayal, greed, and false friends. But maybe Lisa was right. Maybe those walls were keeping out the wrong people. And maybe it was time to stop hiding behind them. The next morning, James called Lisa into his study. I want you to help me with something, he said, his tone more serious than usual. Lisa tilted her head. That sounds suspicious. I want to expose Marla and Steve, James continued. And I think you're the perfect person to help me do it. Lisa grinned. Now you're talking? What's the plan? James leaned forward, his eyes glinting with determination. Let's give them a taste of their own medicine. Lisa's grin widened. Oh, this is going to be fun. And for the first time in months, James felt like he wasn't fighting this battle alone. The morning sun filtered through the mansion's grand windows, casting long shadows across the marble floors. James was seated in his wheelchair, a faint smile playing on his lips. Today was the day everything came to a head. Lisa entered the room, holding a stack of papers. I've got the reports you wanted, she said, dropping them onto the desk in front of him. You were right. Steve's been siphoning money through that bogus desert project. And Marla, well, let's just say her tennis lessons are costing a little more than an instructor's fee. James sighed, flipping through the documents. I knew it. They think I'm an easy target because I'm paralyzed, he smirked. Let's see how they handle a little dose of reality. Lisa leaned against the desk, arms crossed. What's the plan? Do I need to dress up as a secret agent or something? Because I draw the line at wearing heels. James chuckled. No disguise is necessary. We're going to let them expose themselves. That afternoon, Marla arrived in a swirl of Chanel perfume and carefully curated concern. Jimmy, darling, she said, her voice dripping with feigned sweetness. You look so tired. Are you sure you don't want me to handle those boring financial details for you? James smiled warmly. Actually, Marla, I've been thinking about what you said. Maybe it is time for you to take a more active role. Her eyes lit up, though she quickly masked it with a look of practiced humility. Oh, Jimmy, I just want to help you. You can trust me. Of course, James replied, wheeling himself closer to his desk. In fact, why don't we go over the accounts together? I'd love your input on a few recent transactions. Marla's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Now? Well, I suppose I could spare a few minutes. Great, James said, his tone deceptively cheerful. An hour later, Steve arrived, striding into the room with his usual overconfidence. James, my man, got a minute? I've got a killer deal for you, he said, waving a glossy brochure. Prime desert land. This stuff's going to skyrocket in value. You'd be crazy not to jump in. Funny you should mention that, James said, gesturing to the laptop on his desk. I was just reviewing some details about that project. It seems risky, but maybe you can explain why funds from my accounts are already being funneled into it. Steve's grin froze. What? No, that must be some kind of mistake. Must be, James said, his tone cold. Steve glanced at Marla, who sat stiffly in her chair. Marla, help me out here. But Marla was too busy avoiding James's gaze. Lisa entered the room carrying a small tablet. Sorry to interrupt, she said, her voice casual, but I thought you'd want to see this. She handed the tablet to James, who tapped the screen to reveal a series of surveillance videos. The footage showed Steve meeting with a dubious-looking man in a cafe, handing over a thick envelope. Another clip captured Marla in a boutique, laughing with her tennis coach as she swiped James's credit card. Marla's face turned pale. Jimmy, I can explain. Save it, James said sharply. The both of you have been taking advantage of me for months. Did you think I wouldn't notice? Steve held up his hands. Look, James, buddy, this is just a misunderstanding. I was going to loop you in. Don't bother, James interrupted. I've already called my lawyers. The fallout was swift and brutal. By the end of the day, Steve was escorted out of the mansion by security, his access to James's accounts permanently revoked. Marla, realizing her game was up, made a half-hearted attempt to plead for forgiveness. Jimmy, we can work this out, she said, tears glistening in her eyes. James shook his head. We're done, Marla. Pack your things. She left with a dramatic flourish, slamming the door behind her. That evening, James sat on the terrace, a sense of relief washing over him. Lisa joined him, carrying 2 glasses of whiskey. Well, that was satisfying, she said, handing him a glass. James raised his drink, to finally seeing people for who they really are. Lisa clinked her glass against his. And to you, James, you're not half as clueless as you look. He laughed, shaking his head. Thanks, I think. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of the day slowly lifting. You know, James said eventually, I couldn't have done this without you. Lisa smirked. Damn right. But don't think this means I'm sticking around for more billionaire drama. I've got a life, you know? James smiled. Stay as long as you like, Lisa. The mansion's a lot less empty with you in it. And for the first time in years, James felt like he wasn't entirely alone. The walls he'd built around himself had finally started to crumble, leaving room for something real.